Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. This Sunday, on the 8th of March, all across the world, women came out in thousands to not only observe International Women's Day, but to remind their communities and their policymakers that we are far from achieving gender equality. And much, much more needs to be done. In fact, according to the World Economic Forum, the pace at which we are progressing at, it will take another century to reach gender equality across the world. This, of course, is an approximate. It probably will take many countries much longer. But as we stand today in 2020, there still seems to be a confusion on what feminism really represents and who it represents. There is also a question of what the feminist struggle means in different countries. Let's explore some of these questions and much more. Joining us today is Nausheena Hussain, is the co-founder and executive director of Reviving the Islamic Sisterhood for Empowerment, an organization which is dedicated to empower women in her community. She joins us from Brooklyn Park. Also joining us is Rozan Ahmed, who's a Sudanese women's rights activist. She joins us from Dubai. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Now, I'll put this question to the both of you, Rozan. I'd like you to answer it first. What does feminism mean to you in 2020, given the context that we live in, the globalized age we live in, and the demands that women put forth?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And that's a great question, because I feel it is one that we must constantly ask in this evolving massively evolving time. I personally feel that feminism today, it's the loudest voice coming from feminist movements worldwide seems to be that of the West. And as a Sudanese woman who grew up in England and is understanding of both perspectives, I feel it's important that feminism today is a little too centered on Western perspectives and needs to be more inclusive of women around the world. I, for example, don't appreciate the continued male bashing that tends to take place within the feminist quote-unquote struggle. I don't feel that equalizing the sense of mistreatment is a solution. What I think is a solution is to understand what different women across the world require. And when we look at gender equality, for example, that varies around the world too. In the Middle East,
right. Rozan, sorry, I just want to take a couple steps back. When you talk about mistreatment, equalizing mistreatment isn't the solution. Now, that is a part of the discourse we hear a lot. But do you feel like this comes from the feminist narrative, or do you think this comes from the critics who want to undermine the feminist narrative?
I think it comes from both, to be honest. I do. I think it does come from both. We shouldn't have to exclude men in the feminist movement. If anything, they should be included, and they should play a central role, because if anything, our struggles and what we are trying to work towards in terms of equality in policy it is what it is today because of men. So men need to be included, right. and men need to celebrate and understand. So I do think it comes from both. Right.
And Rozan, stay with me on that point of being more inclusive. I want to take this question to Nausheena. Nausheena, now when we talk about how the feminist discourse is taken forward, we talk about also how criticism is becoming more and more aggressive. Why do you think that is? It seems like the more voices that are coming in favor of what the feminist struggle means, the criticism is also becoming more hardened. Do you feel like there's miscommunication on one end of what the goals and agendas are, or do you think there's an insecurity from the other side which comes out in the form of harsh criticism?
Yeah, I think when feminism as a theory began, in the United States anyway, it was very much a white-centered focus and very, it really dominated what white feminism. And it's really evolved from that, because now we're really looking at it from an intersectional standpoint, right?
Right.
It is not just about gender. We are also seeing the intersection of our multiple identities, whether it's our race or our religion or our socioeconomic status. And so as it's evolving, its goals and tactics are changing too. When people don't know what those goals are, then they start to assume things. And I think that is where the misunderstanding begins. And with misunderstanding, we start to see people really criticize where the movement is going. And so I think what we're really coming at it now is that centering those voices that are being affected, but also making sure our allies are also standing by us and making sure that those voices are heard.
Right. Nausheena, you mentioned at the beginning of this answer that for a very long time, the face of feminism was European or Western. As you mentioned, the voices seem to be very white in this conversation. But when we talk about it today, the global picture of feminism, do you think that face has changed? Or do you feel like that still is a dominant picture of it?
Well, I think it's changed dramatically, right? When I watch some of the protests that are happening right now in India, they are led by women, right? In 2017, when Women's March became a global phenomenon, it was women all around the world. So I do feel that we are embracing diversity and being more inclusive in the different races and ethnicities that are the centered voices of the movement.
Right. So Rozan, now Nausheena mentioned there are movements happening all across the world. In Pakistan, too, we had the Aurat March, in which thousands of women came out from different cities to protest what their rights should be, what their rights are, and what happens to them, their own experiences. Now, in all of this, of course, feminism seems to be adapted in the region accordingly to the context. How do you see that playing out in Sudan? And do you feel like that is something that is a common experience, feminism changing its face, changing its form according to the location and according to the region?
Well, yes, it has to be. The Sudanese revolution, which took place last year and lasted for the whole year, was also primarily led by women. But feminism as a concept, as an idea, is not new to Sudan. You know, the world's first queens who won wars as dedicated wives were Sudanese women. The first parliamentarians across North Africa and the Arab world were Sudanese women. So we are not strangers to the concept of feminism. And you're right, the idea, the concept, the fight for gender equality has to permit and has to consider locality and has to consider history. And also
well, why is that so important? That's one of the central questions that comes up. And this is, of course, the criticism in my location, too, that we often hear, which is that it is extrapolating a Western concept and trying to be adapted or trying to be imposed in our region. But that really isn't the case. Why is it essential for it to amend itself, to change its form according to the location?
And that is when it becomes problematic, when we adopt formulas and ideas that are unrelated to our own experiences and what it is we are specifically going through. That is where it becomes the problem. It's important for us as women all around the world to work together, particularly when it comes to policy, when it comes to putting forward, when it comes to politicizing and putting forward the ideas to our leading figures into government. But at the same time, it is important for us as activists and as policy enforcers to ensure that we are considerate of locality and considerate of experience and of history. I'll give you another example. I recently held a dialogue here in the Middle East about women in the workforce, right? Within women in the workforce here in the Middle East, what we must consider are the social areas and also the domestic areas that women here don't necessarily want to get rid of. I, for example, as a Sudanese woman, don't mind staying at home as well as being in the Senate. Does that make sense? I don't mind being traditional as well as modern. So it's not a matter of getting rid of one or the other. We as women are multitaskers. We're multifunctional. We are also maternal, as far as I know.
Right.
So it is important for us to consider our layers and consider our differences in real time and with sincere consideration. We cannot have other entities impose ideas that are unrelated to our reality.
Rozan, I agree with you 100% there. At the end of the day, what matters is agency and the choice to do what you want to do. That's what matters. That's what our fight is for. It's not about imposing a certain standard that all women must adopt. Nausheena, now you being a Muslim woman practicing within the United States, also trying to empower women from your community, what have been some of the hindrances or some of the difficulties you feel in trying to relate to the widespread feminist movement that is ongoing in the United States, if any?
I think you really hit on this point around having choice and having agency. I think what people traditionally have thought about feminism is a very sort of cookie cut program where, you know, we should be taking off the hijab, right? Like we should be more uncovered. And what we are really trying to showcase is that it's all about choice. It's my choice whether to wear it or to not wear it. Right. And so the idea of like copying what's happening in the West or what's happening in the United States or Europe, I think the great point you're bringing up is the fact that we are localizing it. We are looking at what is it that our community here is struggling with and fighting for and making sure that it's not just about equality. It is about equity. It's not about getting the same thing that others are getting, but it's also about getting what I need. And so when we work on public policy, we're creating a legislative agenda that is equitable for all, right? It is not, it is definitely centered around what the needs of women are, but also it is for equitable policies for everyone.
Right. And when we talk about the fact that activism plays a huge role in a feminist discourse, also the movement, any civil movement at all, in fact, I want to talk about the role and the power of women occupying public spaces. What does that really do to society? Rozan, I feel like you would be able to shed an important perspective on this, especially observing the Sudanese revolution and how women took center stage in the protests.
Right. It is unfortunate that very few hands have control of global discourse, discussions and dialogue when it comes to the media and what the media chooses to perpetuate. When it comes to the Sudanese revolution, thousands upon thousands of women were frontlining from the very beginning. It was one image, one female that was projected across the world, and this one particular woman was celebrated, which is wonderful. But at the same time, it also placed her under attack because a lot of attention was placed on this one female rather than a collective of women who came together, who nursed, who fed, who marched, who fought from day one. So there's a gift and a curse to occupying public spaces. When it comes to any struggle, whether it's feminism or whether it's poverty or whatnot, we have to ensure that the voice we choose to be projected is one that is inclusive and collective and understanding of the fact that this is a group effort. This is work that involves policy making. This is work that involves advocating. There's so many entities when it comes to any particular movement, but what we tend to focus on as people, is pictures or captions, and it's almost a simplification of activism turned into a hashtag. And this is where I feel, sometimes I even have, and I'll be honest, I even have a problem sometimes with being called an activist because I feel it's turned into some buzzword that, that incorporates hashtags. And it's so much more complicated than that. And
of course,
Rozan,
stay with me. That's an important point you're bringing up. It's so much more than just a buzzword. It's so much more than reducing it to one small concept. But I want to get a last question into Nausheena. Nausheena, now we're seeing a wave of right-wing politics all across the world. And of course, this comes at a time when individuals have felt like expressing their individual identity is at the peak. It's important, and we have felt empowered to do so. But how is this wave of right-wing politicians, if at all, taking back this movement of feminism, and how do you think they are undermining gender rights?
Well, it's interesting because we face a lot of what we call gendered Islamophobia, right? This fear against who Muslims are, but most of those cases of hate crimes are against Muslim women, right? And it's this fear of they're taking our resources, they're not worthy, they're the other. And we see a rise during election cycles, right? So right now we are in a presidential election cycle, and so we will be otherized. And it's really important that we band with, not just like our allies, but with other community members who are also marginalized communities. And so when the right is attacking one of us, it's like it's really attacking a lot of us. And so our solidarity is really grounded in making sure that our liberation is bound with everyone's, right? So we are working with marginalized communities like the African Americans, like the Native Americans, right? There's so much violence against women in all of those communities. And so sometimes that feminism, that's where we see that intersectionality. And I think you touched on this about like why representation matters so much right now, right? Each individual story is very powerful. You do not know who you are helping heal, inspire, and motivate to take more action during this phase, right? It's not just about me, right? It's about what my story's impact is on the bigger and larger movement.
Right. I take your point there, and thank you so much, Nausheena, for joining us and shedding light, your perspective, giving us your perspective. It was indeed valuable. Rozan, that point of representation, now that is also, I think, a multi-layered issue, because a lot of the conversations that we have been having here in Pakistan have been surrounding when women come out and march, when women come out into movements, they do represent women who aren't able to mobilize themselves, aren't able to come out in the same way. But can one woman really represent another? What's your take on this?
Well, this is the thing, everyone can't be at the table. It's an impossibility. But what we can do is inspire, empower, and hopefully bring about the necessary changes so that any woman from any background, any religious, political, social background, if she chooses to go out and protest, or if she chooses to make a difference within her community positively, she has that right and that choice.
Rozan, stay with me. I also want to introduce Valeria, who's a Mexican writer and broadcast journalist who focuses on human rights and social issues. She joins us from Mexico. Thank you so much, Valeria, for joining us, and welcome to this show. Valeria, now, when we talk about International Women's Day and the visuals and footages that we've been seeing, the most striking have been coming out of Mexico. Explain to us what happened yesterday.
Well, yesterday's march was the biggest feminist mobilization in the country's history. Thousands of protesters gathered to raise their voices against violence against women. The country classified just last year 1,000 killings as femicides, and many of these were the culmination of domestic violence. But although murder was the main focus of yesterday's march, it wasn't the only target. Many protesters I had the opportunity to talk to yesterday, they say they want to eradicate violence against women. And in Mexico, it's a complicated situation. And today, March 9th, a day after the International Women's Day, we're going to have in Mexico the first all-women labor strike. This means that women will stay in their houses. It's going to be a day without women in the country. Even on social media, many millions are joining this strike.
What is the purpose? What is the end goal there? What are women trying to bring to light by this strike?
Well, the main target is to end the violence against women, and of course the most a present thing is the number of femicides that have been registered in the country. Just last month, well, in this year, the first 2 months, already had 40 femicides. And the violence against women has been rising in Mexico because of the culture of machismo, which is deeply rooted in Mexico's society, and it's difficult to change. So that's why we need this cultural revolution. And what women in Mexico are trying to do is, in order to change that, is protesting, is doing this strike, and basically demonstrating on the streets with powerful messages, also videos on social media. They're a new feminist collective that are pushing these ideas all the way through society, and of course demanding the government to stop violence against women and to protect women's rights.
Right. Valeria, we're going to talk more about the violence that women, specifically in Mexico, are facing, are experiencing, and the grave consequences of that and how widespread that is after later on in this show. But you make an important point there about machismo and the culture there. Rozan, we've been talking about feminist movements and how they have evolved in 2020. What are we seeing them take their shape in, the form they're coming out to us in? Do you feel like masculinity has also changed with how feminism is evolving?
Yes. Well, this is a song in Mexico from this Mexican singer called Julieta Venegas, which has become this feminist anthem. And there's a phrase in this song that it says, Mexican women are uprising and men don't know how to react or what to do. And I think this kind of explained the situation in Mexico. As I said, machismo is deeply rooted in Mexican culture and these social attitudes. And somehow men are, of course, masculinity is changing in Mexico, but also it's kind of confusing for some men to see this uprising after years of silent, after years of women being oppressed, being violated. So right. It's changing, but of course it's going to take a cultural revolution to change this deeply rooted machismo.
Right. Rozan, Ahmed, when we talk about this masculinity that we're witnessing, of course, Valeria talks about Mexico in a very specific context, how that masculinity has led to Mexico having one of the world's highest rates of femicides. But when we talk about culture at large, the global culture at large, do you feel like there's a greater cognizance at the hands of media outlets, various companies, that the face of masculinity needs to change?
And actually, I think if us as women and us as so-called feminists have anything in common, it is the problem of patriarchy. So yes, there is a common denominator there, which is why I think a wider conversation around masculinity has come about. But I don't necessarily know if it's a good or bad thing, because we talk now of issues such as toxic masculinity, right? At the same time, we don't bring up toxic femininity, because that exists as well. And if we are going to look at the toxicity of men and their general existence and what they are doing to us women, then we should also look at what we do to each other at the same time. So I do think culturally, yes, there have been some positive changes. There has been some address, some self-analysis of what it means to be masculine. And that is a conversation that men should lead along with women, and as women supporting them. But at the same time, we should also look at issues of toxicity amongst women, because whether or not we choose to accept it, it is a reality. So again, it's the polarizations of conversations that tend to come out of feminist movements that can be problematic at times.
How do we keep everyone in check in this? Now, we know that women often at times when they show aggression, it is reactionary to many of the experiences they've faced. That's the conversations I hear from women in my lives, that when they do target their hatred in such an aggressive form, it's because of their experiences. How do we balance that conversation when we have seen such a history of violence and mistreatment of women?
Yes, in my opinion, it is coming together. It really is. My opinion, it is coming together. We must involve men more in our activities, in our policy making, in our advocacy, and in our healing as men and as women. We must heal together. And I think, I'm not a psychologist, and I absolutely am not speaking for all women in any way, but based on my own personal experience and based with the hundreds of women I've worked with in the past, there is an element of healing that is required. Right. And we must involve men within that necessary point.
Rozan, so that's a necessary point, the idea of healing. And thank you so much for your time, Rozan, Ahmed, for joining us and taking out the time to talk to us. Now we're joined by Ms. Maleeha Hussain, who's the Executive Director of Meher Garz Center for Learning. She joins us from Islamabad. Ms. Hussain, now, as we've been talking about International Women's Day, how it unfolded all across the world, how did you feel like the success of that impacted Pakistan? We had the Aurat March yesterday. We saw thousands of women coming out. Do you think the goal was achieved of the march?
I don't look at International Women's Day as one march. The purpose of the day, and a lot of people, not just me, but I know of a lot of people who work on women's issues, we use International Women's Day to sit down and reflect on what have we achieved so far, where do we stand today, and what are some of the more pressing issues in our society, in our country, that we need to focus on in the coming year and the coming years. So that is the march has somehow been politicized and highlighted a lot in the media, but that is not how we look at the International Women's Day. It's much bigger than one march.
It's much bigger than one march, of course. And you are talking about how it has been politicized and brought into light in the media, but also talking about the fact that something like this, activism, does have power. The fact that women do come out in a number of groups, thousands of women come out, it does spur a conversation, does it not? One that has for a very long time been suppressed.
For one day, and then slowly the discussion will continue for a few days, and then it dies down again. So when you look at International Women's Day, that's what I'm saying, that how much time do we need to spend talking about the pros and cons of the march, or was it effective or not? It's women's way of talking about their issues, coming out on the road with placards, with slogans, sharing what their issues are. But we also, at the same time, have to see what is the culture in Pakistan. Is the society ready to listen to all the issues that women have?
Aren't civil movements supposed to challenge culture? Now, this is a central question that you bring up, and I'm glad that you bring it up. Now, where does cultural sensitivity play a role here? Because movements are supposed to challenge norms that have been embedded. In many ways, a lot of toxic norms that have been embedded. As I was talking to Valeria from Mexico as well, she talks about machismo, how that is leading to femicides in Mexico. The march in Mexico yesterday was about that. Now, shouldn't these norms that culture highlights and makes sacred be challenged if they are harming women?
Yes. Talking about one particular issue and all the women coming out collectively so that one particular issue is addressed, that can be a part of a movement. What happens in Pakistan is that women sort of come up with their own placards. There was no one agenda even in yesterday's march. Everybody came out with their own issues, which are very genuine issues. But you have to see, if you want to exert pressure, on a group, maybe the parliamentarians or the law enforcement agencies or the government overall, then you come out on the streets with one agenda item collectively so that you send a very strong message to that group that this is what we are asking for and this is what we want done.
Right.
But that was not the case.
Right, Ms. Maleeha, stay with me. I want to take this point to Valeria. Valeria, is there power in itself of coming out and expressing your stories? Ms. Maleeha makes a strong point there. If it doesn't translate into change in terms of policy, does it really have a purpose? But is there power in the act of coming out in numbers?
Yes, of course. Yesterday, as I said, was the biggest feminist mobilization in the country's history. So this is big, and demands for justice for enslaved women have gained momentum in recent months. Since last summer, Mexico's feminist revolt have been gathering steam, and women in Mexico are referring to this growing movement as the feminist spring, to refer this as a new wave to change things, as a new revolution to open eyes for the government and also society. So they are calling this a new feminist wave in Mexico, and they say they won't stop raising their voices until they get justice in the cases of femicides, but also protections, and also something so like normal to be to feel safe while they walk on the streets. And this is something that that really needs to happen, and this is something that needs to happen in Mexico, that women need to be safe just in the public space and in the streets, and
right.
They are demonstrating just for that, just safety.
Right. Valeria, that is a sentiment that has also been echoed within Pakistan, that coming out and demanding your rights is essential. Of course, that's the first step to bringing about meaningful change. Ms. Maleeha Hussain has her own perspective, which is of course also respected, and sheds a light on another way of looking at the matter. But we have these discussions to make sense of what is happening around us. And stay with me. We're going to continue our conversation after a short break. When we return, we look at why violence against women continues to persist across the world, even though we're seeing so many women come out in numbers. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. In many parts of the world, violence against women is not an anomaly, but is the common experience. According to the United Nations figures, 1 in 3 of all women and girls experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. The organization further states, and I quote, "Violence against women and girls is amongst the most widespread and devastating human rights violations in the world. But much of it is often underreported due to impunity, shame, and gender inequality." On today's show, we take a closer look at why violence remains to be so widespread, even though we have more and more people challenging and advocating against us. Joining us today is Maleeha Hussain, who's the Executive Director of Mehergar, a Center for Learning. She joins us from Islamabad. Also joining us is Valeria, who's a Mexican writer and broadcast journalist who focuses on human rights and social issues from Mexico, and Kimberley Motley, who is an American international human rights attorney. She joins us from New York. Thank you all for joining us, and welcome to the show. Kimberley, I'd like to begin with you and start off from the issue of reporting violence in the first place. Now, a lot of facts and figures that we get don't truly depict the extent of the problem. I mentioned a couple of issues as to why reporting doesn't happen. What more can you tell us about what really hinders people from coming forth?
Well, I think part of the problem is, unfortunately, since the beginning of time, violence against women has been accepted part of many cultures. And so in addition for women to overcome that hurdle of wanting to report it, often they are confronted with the fact, if they do report it, will they be taken seriously? So unfortunately, a lot of women, because violence is accepted in so many cultures around the world, from the US to Afghanistan, it's just they just feel like if they do report it, that they'll receive more violent repercussions against them, which unfortunately happens quite often.
Right. And when we talk about these violent repercussions against them, what really takes, what form do these repercussions take?
Well, often maybe the aggressor will become even more aggressive because they feel like the woman has spoken out against something that they did wrong, and so they punish the women even further. And frankly, when I've often seen women who have tried to report violence to law enforcement, sort of microaggressions that they receive from law enforcement, by and large, the people that they'll report it to will be another man. And so that woman may not feel comfortable with telling her story to that man. And quite often, that man will not take her story seriously and will put her in an even worse situation than when she first came to report what was happening to her. And
Right.
so I think that, that's what happens, unfortunately, in many households.
Right. Ms. Maleeha, Hussain, you heard Kimberley here put out various reasons as to why women don't come forth or feel uncomfortable in reporting what is happening to them. Do you feel like this is something that resonates with you working and studying the context, especially of South Asia, when it comes to violence against women?
Yes, all of that is true here in Pakistan also. And in addition, the stigma attached to different forms of violence against women, whether it's sexual harassment or rape or domestic violence. Because of the stigma, a lot of women don't report. That's why the reporting rate is so low in Pakistan. Because there's always this fear of what will people think of me. Will they consider me to be a bad woman, a bad wife, if my husband's beating me up?
Valeria, we're talking about men, especially in terms of police men and those who are supposed to be lawmakers, those are supposed to be responsible for the implementation of law. And the fact that their gender plays a critical role in how the experience of women is taken forth from there, whether it's reported, whether it's carried forward, whether the aggressor is given impunity. Do you feel like in Mexico that has been one of the reasons why the situation is as grave as it is today, where 10 women almost get femicide reaches 10 cases per day?
Yeah, that's correct. And very few cases are investigated. So as they say, this stigma that goes with the woman that it's demanding rights, or they need to go to the prosecutor or police to put their case. There was a social movement that started a few months ago under the hashtag I Believe You, and it was pushed by most of women in Mexico, and that was exactly what they were trying to eradicate, to believe what women are saying in terms of their cases when they've been attacked or raped, or they've been suffering abuse or violence. So this is an ongoing problem in Mexico, and the problem is the justice system in Mexico is rotten. So this type of situations, they got in total impunity because the system also is not prepared for this. Right. So these cases are undergoing in these social movements, not even on the court or with policemen.
Right. Kimberley, we have been seeing a wave of harassment cases come forth ever since the Me Too movement, but we are also seeing a flawed system in place where it becomes very difficult for a woman to actually prove in court that that harassment took place. Just take us through that. What are the legal loopholes, and how can the system be strengthened in order to bring justice to these women?
Well, basically, some of the legal loopholes is it's often one person's word against another. And so that's a problem, because you have the person that is harassing a woman that will, by and large, not admit that they're harassing a woman in court. And so therefore that prevents the case from moving forward. In addition to that, usually the person that's harassing, well, quite often anyway, is a person that's in a position of power. And so you have other people that may witness these things, but they're unwilling or unable to come forward because they're concerned about their jobs being lost or the personal repercussions that they may be invoked upon them for supporting a colleague who they know has been harassed. So I think that's also a bigger problem. And, and frankly, also in a lot of courts, like in places like everywhere, U.S.,
Right.
Afghanistan, a lot of the feeling is it's not really that big of a deal, that the woman is being harassed in this way. Just suck it up and deal with it.
Kimberley,
And
stay
that's
with me on
something
that point. I want to take this forward, but before that, I just want to ask one last question to Valeria. Valeria, now you talk about this movement within Mexico that's coming in full force. Are there demands that are in place that are resonating with lawmakers? Are they taking the situation more seriously now?
Yeah, well, in terms of femicide, they are trying to make this process clearly for the courts to identify when it's a case of femicide, or is just a regular homicide. So basically, one of the demands, like specifically in terms of changing these laws and make it more clearer in terms of policy making, and also to prepare the courts and the judges to know how to deal with this type of cases. And that's a reality in Mexico. They don't even know how to judge this type of cases, how to prosecute in these cases. And this is something that it's affecting the country, of course, women and society in general. And because of the justice system, it's not working the way it
Right.
needs to work in terms of gender violence.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Valeon, for joining us, taking the time to talk to us. Ms. Maleeha, Hussain, moving back a little, we hear two perspectives. One of in Mexico, where women are coming out in large numbers because they see the central issue as damaging not just them, but society at large, the entire nation. And now we also hear Kimberley's perspective and take on it, why many women don't come forth and report it, because even though violence is common, it's also considered to be normal. Do you feel like awareness, and do you feel like bringing this fact into discussion that violence shouldn't be normalized is an essential component of reducing it?
Yes, I think Kimberley was talking about sexual harassment.
Yeah.
People around the globe don't take sexual harassment of women, especially as a serious issue. Even in Pakistan, if somebody touches somebody, or teases them. And if you talk to not only elderly men, but older women also, and they'll say things like that, what's the big deal? He only touched you, he didn't shoot you. So they don't take this issue very seriously. And there has been work going on in Pakistan for the last almost 20 years. The Me Too movement started very recently, but in Pakistan, the Alliance Against Sexual Harassment started working in 2000. They worked for about 10 years.
Ms. Maleeha, as you're talking about this, that this movement, the work for it has been happening for quite some time. Now, the implementation part is what becomes a difficulty and something that we're seeing all across the world. What can be done to strengthen implementation?
Yes, that is what I was going to share, that we have recently conducted a 10-year review of how this particular law of workplace sexual harassment was implemented, and we've seen some breakthrough results. Because in Pakistan, the parliament passed a special law, and in order to use that special law, you don't have to go to the police or to a court of law. This law gives organizations a specific mechanism that they need to institutionalize by forming a 3-member standing inquiry committee with at least one female member on the committee. And employees of an organization, if they are sexually harassed, men or women, the law protects both equally, they can go and report their case to the standing inquiry committee, and then the committee is supposed to conduct an inquiry in confidentiality and find the facts and decide. And they're supposed to do all of this within 30 days. And
Right.
whatever their decision based on the findings is supposed to be implemented within 7 days. Now, just because these cases are not reported in the media, it seems like the law is not being implemented. But after conducting consultations in all the provinces, in the bigger cities, bringing in people from different sectors, like from the government, from the private sector, civil society, media, unions, employee unions.
Right.
We found out that a lot of organizations
are doing their work. Ms. Maleeha, unfortunately, we're running short on time. I take your point there, and that's something that we will like to discuss more in the future about how these organizations are working towards bringing a change. But on that note, I'd also like to introduce Professor Kristin Vala, who is a professor of sustainability at the University of Iceland. She joins us from Iceland. Thank you so much, Professor Vala, for joining us. Now, the issue that we're seeing here is about gender inequality. We're seeing violence occurring because there are some cemented cultural norms at play. We're also seeing violence continuously being carried out because there's impunity. But when we look at the case of Iceland, in all indexes, it seems to have great gender parity. Do you feel like that has helped the reduction of violence against women as well?
Definitely, and giving women a voice and working towards making their participation in society equal to that of men, that has reduced abuse, although it has not entirely disappeared. But what we need to understand is that violence against women is very much culturally based. If the general conduct within a country is that men have a power over women, and then young boys and young men are brought up in that atmosphere, then nothing will change. So education is incredibly important in making girls and young women understand that they do have an equal voice to their brothers or cousins, and also that young men are brought up in this atmosphere so that they understand that their sisters and nieces are equal to them and should have an equal voice.
Right. Professor Kristin Vala, saying that this is essential in order to change the socialization process in a way that women do feel like they're at par with the men in their lives. They feel like their voice matters. You feel like that brings about systematic change, but you also mentioned violence doesn't completely disappear. In that pocket there, how can legislation be strengthened? I think
transparency is crucial. So as soon as there is a platform for women to step up and speak about their experiences, then that helps to bring out what's going on behind the four walls of a home, for example. And also the schools need to have a platform where students can come and talk about the violence. You know, it just brings to mind my daughter is a psychologist, and she was working with a charity in southern India, where she understood in speaking and training teachers there, was that there was some violence occurring within the local families, and the teachers said to the girls to go home and pray. And my daughter, who is brought up in the UK, said, really, isn't there something else they should be doing? And then that brought the discussion to the teacher trainees as to what they could do in order to help these girls if they were suffering from some violence.
Right. Professor Kristin Vala, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but at the end of this, you bring out a really important point that violence against women shouldn't be inevitable. The answer to prevent it shouldn't be to go and pray more. It shouldn't be to put the responsibility on the woman, but it should be a systematic change which is brought from the socialization process to bringing about meaningful change in legislation. That's a point we're going to discuss in the future as well. But for now and for today, thank you so much, Professor Kristin, Vala, for joining us from Iceland, and Kimberley, Motley, for joining us from New York. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.